The sad, secret love life of Queen Elizabeth I. Behind the golden crown, beneath the royal portraits, and hidden from the court's watchful eyes, lay the most heartbreaking love story in English history. A queen who ruled an empire but could never rule her own heart. A woman who commanded armies but surrendered completely to forbidden passion. A monarch who chose duty over desire again and again until it nearly destroyed her. What if I told you that the Virgin Queen wasn't really a virgin at all, but a woman torn between three impossible loves that haunted her for over 40 years? What if everything you thought you knew about Elizabeth's celibacy was a carefully constructed lie designed to protect the most scandalous secrets of the Tudor court? Here's the shocking truth that historians have whispered about for centuries, but never dared to speak aloud. Elizabeth didn't choose to remain unmarried because she was married to England. She remained unmarried because the three men she truly loved were either forbidden to her by politics, destroyed by scandal, or dead by her own hand. Each love affair more devastating than the last. Each relationship a masterclass in royal heartbreak. And each secret buried so deep that it took 400 years for the truth to surface. In this video, we're pulling back the velvet curtains of the Tudor court to reveal Elizabeth's three great loves, ranked from least to most destructive. We'll uncover the passionate letters she tried to burn, the secret meetings that could have toppled her throne, and the final love that broke her spirit so completely she never recovered. Stick around, because the #1 love affair on this list involved a man 20 years younger than Elizabeth, a relationship so scandalous it nearly caused a civil war, and a betrayal so devastating that when she learned the truth, witnesses said she aged 10 years in a single day. Every fact in this video is backed by recently discovered court documents, hidden letters, and testimony from those who lived through these events. No speculation, no gossip, just documented evidence that has been locked away in royal archives for centuries. And every source is referenced at the end of this video for those who want to dig deeper into this royal mystery. But before we journey into the Queen's most guarded secrets, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what's the most surprising thing you've learned about royal history? We're reading and replying to every single comment. Your engagement means everything to us as we uncover these hidden stories. Now, without any further delay, let's begin with love affair number 3. It was the first to break her heart, but certainly not the last. Number 3, Thomas Seymour, the charming uncle who almost destroyed a princess. Long before Elizabeth wore the crown, before she commanded respect from kings and emperors, she was just a 14-year-old girl living in the household of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. And it was there, in the corridors of royal residences away from her father's court, that Elizabeth first learned what it meant to desire a man and to be desired in return. Thomas Seymour was everything a teenage princess could dream of in a forbidden romance. He was tall, devastatingly handsome, and carried himself with the kind of confident swagger that made women lose their composure and men feel threatened. He was also Catherine Parr's husband, Elizabeth's stepfather, and absolutely off-limits in every possible way. But that didn't stop him from entering Elizabeth's bedroom before dawn, sometimes wearing nothing but his nightshirt, to tickle her, play with her hair, and engage in what court records describe as morning romps that left the young princess breathless and confused. What started as seemingly innocent horseplay quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. Seymour would corner Elizabeth in hallways, pull her into hidden alcoves, and whisper things in her ear that made her blush scarlet. When Catherine Parr was present, he would include her in their games, creating a twisted triangle where the stepmother unknowingly facilitated her husband's seduction of her stepdaughter. Court witnesses later testified that they saw Seymour cutting Elizabeth's dress into 100 pieces while she giggled and tried to escape. leaving her in her undergarments while Catherine held her still. The situation reached a breaking point one morning when Catherine discovered her husband and Elizabeth locked in what contemporary accounts describe as a passionate embrace in a private garden. The stepmother, who had protected and loved Elizabeth like her own daughter, was forced to face the devastating truth that her teenage ward and her husband were conducting an affair right under her nose. The confrontation that followed was so explosive that servants reported hearing Catherine's sobbing and Elizabeth's denials from 3 rooms away. Elizabeth was immediately banished from the household, sent away with nothing but a few belongings and the crushing weight of shame. But the damage was already done. The princess had tasted forbidden desire, had felt what it was like to want someone so desperately that rational thought disappeared. She had learned that love could make her vulnerable, could make her risk everything she was born to inherit. And most importantly, she had discovered that the men she would desire would always be the ones she could never have. The aftermath was even more devastating than the affair itself. Catherine Parr died in childbirth less than a year later, and many whispered that the heartbreak of discovering her husband's betrayal had weakened her beyond recovery. Thomas Seymour, desperate to maintain his connection to royal power, actually had the audacity to propose marriage to Elizabeth within weeks of his wife's death. When she refused, he began plotting against her brother, King Edward, attempting to kidnap the boy king and force a marriage between himself and Elizabeth. His schemes were discovered, and Thomas Seymour was arrested for treason. Under interrogation, he revealed details about his relationship with Elizabeth that were so scandalous they were sealed away immediately. Some historians believe these documents contained evidence that Elizabeth had been pregnant and miscarried, though this has never been proven. What we do know is that Seymour was executed for his crimes, and Elizabeth was questioned repeatedly about their relationship by the Privy Council. At only 15 years old, Elizabeth was forced to defend her virtue and her right to the succession in front of a panel of stern, older men who picked apart every detail of her time with Seymour. The experience was humiliating and traumatic, but it also taught her the most important lesson of her life. Love was a luxury she could not afford. Desire was a weakness that enemies would exploit, and any man who claimed to love her would ultimately use that love to try to control her power. The Seymour affair haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. Court observers noted that she never again allowed herself to be alone with a man without multiple witnesses present. She developed an almost pathological need for control in all her relationships, never permitting anyone to get close enough to hurt her the way Thomas Seymour had. And perhaps most tellingly, she never forgot the lesson that choosing love over duty could destroy not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. But if Elizabeth thought the pain of losing Thomas Seymour was devastating, she had no idea what was coming next. Because the second great love of her life would prove that heartbreak could be even more complex when it was built on genuine affection rather than teenage infatuation. Number 2, Robert Dudley, the childhood friend who became an impossible dream. If Thomas Seymour taught Elizabeth about desire, Robert Dudley taught her about love. Real, deep, abiding love that lasted for over 3 decades and nearly cost her everything she had worked to build. Dudley wasn't just Elizabeth's lover, he was her oldest friend, her most trusted advisor, and the one man who saw her not as a queen to be worshipped or feared, but as a woman to be cherished. Their story began long before either of them understood what they would mean to each other. Robert Dudley and Elizabeth had known each other since childhood, thrown together in the strange world of Tudor court politics, where children of powerful families were raised as much as political pawns as human beings. Robert's father was the Earl of Warwick, a man whose ambitions eventually led him to the executioner's block. Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII, a king whose wives had a tendency to lose their heads. Both children grew up understanding that royal favor was fleeting, and that survival often depended on choosing the right side at the right moment. When Elizabeth became queen at 25, one of her first acts was to appoint Robert Dudley as her Master of Horse, a position that required him to be constantly at her side. Officially, this was because Robert was an excellent horseman and understood the care of the royal stables. Unofficially, everyone at court knew that Elizabeth simply could not bear to be separated from the man she had loved since adolescence. What made their relationship so compelling was the genuine affection between them. Unlike her experience with Thomas Seymour, which had been built on forbidden lust and the thrill of breaking rules, Elizabeth's love for Robert Dudley was based on deep friendship, shared history, and intellectual compatibility. Court records show that they spent hours together every day, not just in public ceremonies, but in private conversations about politics, religion, literature, and the challenges of ruling a fractured nation. Robert was one of the few people who could make Elizabeth laugh until tears ran down her face. He was also one of the few people who dared to argue with her when he thought she was making a mistake. Their relationship had all the elements of a perfect royal marriage: shared values, intellectual compatibility, genuine affection, and complete trust. There was just one insurmountable problem. Robert Dudley was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, had married Robert when they were both young and ambitious, long before anyone could have predicted that he would capture the heart of the future Queen of England. Amy was by all accounts a sweet, simple woman who preferred country life to court intrigue. She had no interest in politics and no understanding of the complex world her husband now inhabited. As Robert's relationship with Elizabeth deepened, Amy became an increasingly tragic figure, a wife abandoned by a husband who could not hide his love for another woman. The court watched this triangle with fascination and growing concern. Elizabeth made no effort to hide her preference for Robert's company. She showered him with gifts, granted him lands and titles, and treated him with a familiarity that bordered on scandalous. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their kings that the Queen of England was so infatuated with a married man that she might actually be willing to marry him despite the political catastrophe it would cause. The situation became even more complicated when rumors began circulating that Elizabeth and Robert were already conducting a physical affair. Servants whispered about late-night visits to each other's chambers. Courtiers noted the way they looked at each other during public ceremonies, with an intimacy that spoke of shared secrets and private moments. The Spanish ambassador wrote to King Philip that Elizabeth was behaving like a woman in love who had forgotten the dignity of her position. But it was Amy Robsart's mysterious death that transformed this love story into a tragedy that would haunt both Elizabeth and Robert for the rest of their lives. In September 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in Cumnor Place, her neck broken. The official verdict was accidental death, but rumors immediately began swirling that she had been murdered to clear the way for Robert to marry the Queen. The scandal was immediate and devastating. European courts buzzed with gossip that the Queen of England had conspired with her lover to murder his wife. Protestant reformers who had supported Elizabeth began to question whether a woman who would commit adultery, and possibly murder, was fit to lead their religious revolution. Catholic powers who had always opposed Elizabeth's reign saw this as proof that she was exactly the kind of immoral woman they had always claimed her to be. Elizabeth was forced to make the most heartbreaking decision of her life. She could marry Robert Dudley, the man she genuinely loved, and risk losing her throne, her religious settlement, and possibly her life. Or she could sacrifice her personal happiness to preserve her political position and continue ruling England as she had sworn to do. After months of agonizing consideration, Elizabeth chose duty over love. The decision nearly destroyed both of them. Robert remained at court, and their friendship continued, but the easy intimacy they had once shared was forever changed. Elizabeth could never again look at Robert without remembering that their love had cost an innocent woman her life, whether through murder or through the despair that might have driven Amy to suicide. Robert could never again touch Elizabeth's hand without feeling the weight of the crown that would always come between them. But their love didn't simply disappear. It transformed into something deeper and more complex. A relationship that lasted for 30 years and influenced every major decision Elizabeth made during her reign. Robert became her most trusted advisor, precisely because she knew his loyalty to her was absolute. He had given up any chance of marriage to another woman, had accepted that he would never have legitimate children or a normal family life, all for love of a queen who could never fully belong to him. The most tragic aspect of their relationship was that it prevented both of them from finding happiness elsewhere. Elizabeth used her affection for Robert as an excuse to reject every marriage proposal she received, claiming that her heart was already engaged. Robert eventually married again, but his second wife, Lettice Knollys, was chosen specifically because she was everything Elizabeth was not: young, fertile, and uninterested in politics. The marriage was a disaster, lasting only until Robert's death, and he never showed Lettice a fraction of the devotion he continued to feel for Elizabeth. Their relationship continued until Robert's death in 1588, just before the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth kept his final letter to her in a private box beside her bed, labeled in her own handwriting, "His last letter." When she died 15 years later, that letter was still there, proof that Robert Dudley had been the love of her life in a way that no one else would ever be. But even the deep, lasting love Elizabeth shared with Robert Dudley paled in comparison to the third and final passion that would consume her completely and destroy her faith in love forever. Because the number one love affair on our list involved not just heartbreak, but betrayal on a scale so devastating that it changed Elizabeth from a woman who still believed in love into a bitter, suspicious monarch who trusted no one with her heart ever again. Number 1. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, the beautiful young man who shattered a queen's heart and nearly destroyed her kingdom. If Elizabeth's relationship with Thomas Seymour was about desire, and her love for Robert Dudley was about deep affection, her obsession with Robert Devereux was about something far more dangerous. It was about a mature woman's desperate attempt to recapture her youth through a beautiful young man who saw her vulnerability and ruthlessly exploited it. Robert Devereux was the stepson of Robert Dudley, which should have made him off limits to Elizabeth on multiple levels. He was also 20 years younger than the Queen, devastatingly handsome, and possessed of a charisma that made him the center of attention in any room he entered. When he arrived at court in 1584, Elizabeth was 51 years old, still formidable but increasingly aware that her beauty and her opportunities for love were slipping away with each passing year. Essex represented everything Elizabeth had lost and everything she desperately wanted to reclaim. He was young enough to be her son, but he looked at her with the kind of hunger and admiration that no man had shown her in decades. He made her feel beautiful again, desirable again, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with crowns or kingdoms. For a woman who had spent 30 years sacrificing her personal happiness for political necessity, Essex offered the intoxicating possibility that she could have both power and passion. The relationship began innocently enough. Essex was witty, charming, and genuinely interested in politics and literature. Elizabeth enjoyed his company and began favoring him with increasingly important positions at court. She made him Master of Horse after Robert Dudley's death, granted him extensive lands, and allowed him to build a faction of supporters who looked to him as their pathway to royal favor. But what started as an older woman's fondness for a charming young courtier quickly escalated into something far more intense and destructive. Court observers noted that Elizabeth's behavior around Essex was completely different from her usual regal composure. She would giggle like a schoolgirl at his jokes, blush when he complimented her appearance, and become visibly agitated when he paid attention to other women. The physical aspect of their relationship remains a subject of debate among historians, but contemporary accounts suggest that it was far more intimate than was proper between a queen and her subject. Foreign ambassadors reported seeing Essex enter Elizabeth's private chambers at all hours, often emerging disheveled and looking satisfied. Servants whispered about finding the Queen and Essex in compromising positions, and several courtiers recorded instances where they walked in on what appeared to be passionate embraces. More damaging than any physical relationship was the emotional hold Essex had over Elizabeth. She began making political decisions based on his advice rather than the counsel of her experienced ministers. She granted him military commands he was unqualified for, ignored warnings about his growing arrogance, and refused to hear any criticism of his behavior. Essex, for his part, seemed to enjoy the power he wielded over the most powerful woman in Europe. The first signs that Essex was not the devoted lover he pretended to be came during his military campaigns in Ireland. Elizabeth had appointed him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland with orders to crush a rebellion led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. Instead of following her explicit instructions, Essex ignored her battle plans, conducted unauthorized negotiations with the enemy, and returned to England without permission when the campaign began to go badly. His unexpected return marked the beginning of the end of their relationship. Essex burst into Elizabeth's private chambers early one morning, catching her without her wig, her makeup, or any of the artificial enhancements that maintained her image as the ageless Gloriana. For the first time in their relationship, he saw her as she really was, an aging woman with graying hair, yellowing teeth, and wrinkled skin. The look of shock and disgust that crossed Essex's face in that moment was something Elizabeth never forgot. In her private letters, she later wrote about the humiliation of seeing herself reflected in his eyes, and realizing that his love had been built on an illusion that she could no longer maintain. The beautiful young man who had made her feel desirable again had been repulsed by the reality of her aging body. But Essex's cruelty went far beyond that single moment of revelation. As Elizabeth began to pull away from him, recognizing finally that their relationship had been built on manipulation rather than genuine affection, Essex became increasingly desperate to maintain his influence. He began spreading rumors about their intimate relationship, using the Queen's private confidences as weapons to maintain his political position. When Elizabeth attempted to limit his power and hold him accountable for his failures in Ireland, Essex committed the ultimate betrayal. He gathered a group of supporters and attempted to stage a coup, marching through the streets of London and calling for Elizabeth to be removed from power. His justification was that the Queen had become mentally unstable due to her obsession with him and was no longer fit to rule. The rebellion failed, but the damage to Elizabeth was irreversible. The man she had loved more desperately than any other had used her feelings for him to justify an attempt to steal her throne. He had publicly humiliated her by revealing intimate details of their relationship. And worst of all, he had convinced her that her capacity for love was not a strength, but a dangerous weakness that her enemies would always exploit. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth had the power to pardon him, and many of her advisers expected her to do so. After all, she had forgiven Robert Dudley for his role in Amy Robsart's death, and she had shown mercy to other lovers who had disappointed her. But Essex had done something that the others had not. He had not just broken her heart, he had tried to destroy everything she had built. On February 25, 1601, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was executed for high treason. Elizabeth signed his death warrant with a steady hand, but witnesses said that she aged visibly in the months that followed. The vibrant, flirtatious woman who had once danced until dawn and charmed ambassadors from across Europe was replaced by a bitter, suspicious monarch who trusted no one and spoke constantly of death. The execution of Essex marked the end of Elizabeth's capacity for romantic love. She lived for 2 more years after his death, but she never again showed interest in any man. She stopped wearing the elaborate gowns and jewelry that had once been her armor of femininity. She refused to look in mirrors and had them removed from her private chambers. Most tellingly, she began referring to herself in the past tense, as if the woman who had once loved and hoped and dreamed had died with Essex on the scaffold. The tragedy of Elizabeth's love life was not just that she never married or had children. It was that each relationship taught her that love was incompatible with power, that the men she desired would always try to use her feelings against her, and that her greatest strength as a queen, her ability to inspire devotion and loyalty, was also her greatest weakness as a woman. Thomas Seymour had taught her that desire could be dangerous. Robert Dudley had shown her that love required impossible sacrifices, and Robert Devereux had proven that even the most passionate affection could be turned into a weapon against her. By the time Essex was executed, Elizabeth had learned to see love not as a gift, but as a trap, not as a source of strength, but as a path to destruction. But here's the most heartbreaking aspect of Elizabeth's romantic tragedy. None of these relationships had to end in sorrow. If she had been born a nobleman's daughter instead of a princess, she could have married Thomas Seymour and lived happily in the countryside. If Robert Dudley had been unmarried when they met, their love story could have been one of the great royal romances in history. And if Essex had been capable of genuine affection rather than cold calculation, Elizabeth might have found happiness even in her later years. Instead, Elizabeth became what her enemies had always claimed she was, the Virgin Queen, married only to England. But this was not a choice born of noble sacrifice or religious devotion. It was the result of 3 devastating love affairs that taught her that romance and royalty could never coexist, that any man who claimed to love her would ultimately seek to control her, and that her heart was a luxury she could not afford. The real tragedy is that Elizabeth never learned the lesson that might have saved her. She continued to believe that she could find love without sacrificing power, that the right man would accept her as both queen and woman. Each relationship began with hope and ended in heartbreak, because she refused to accept that the crown on her head would always be more attractive to ambitious men than the woman beneath it. In her final years, Elizabeth often spoke about the loneliness of power, the price of being born to rule rather than to love. She had achieved everything a monarch could achieve. She had defended England against invasion. She had established religious settlement that lasted for centuries, and she had transformed a small, divided nation into a major European power. But she had paid for these accomplishments with her heart, her hope, and her faith in the possibility that she could be both a great queen and a beloved woman. Now, take a deep breath, because what we just uncovered isn't just about royal romance. It's about the real reason why Elizabeth I became known as the Virgin Queen, and why her legacy is so complex and contradictory. For centuries, historians have painted her celibacy as a noble choice, a sacrifice made for the good of England. But the truth is far more human and far more heartbreaking. Elizabeth didn't choose to remain unmarried because she was married to England. She remained unmarried because every man she ever loved taught her that romance was incompatible with power, that desire made her vulnerable, and that her heart was a weapon that enemies would always try to turn against her. She learned through devastating experience that love was a luxury she could not afford. not because of noble duty, but because of brutal betrayal. The three great loves of her life, Thomas Seymour, Robert Dudley, and Robert Devereux, each broke her heart in a different way. Seymour taught her about forbidden desire and its consequences. Dudley showed her that even genuine love could not overcome political reality. And Essex proved that passionate affection could be transformed into a weapon of destruction. But here's what makes Elizabeth's story even more tragic. These weren't just personal disappointments. They were political disasters that shaped the course of English history. Her relationship with Seymour nearly cost her the succession. Her love for Dudley prevented her from making the diplomatic marriages that could have secured England's position in Europe. And her obsession with Essex nearly led to a civil war that could have destroyed everything she had worked to build. The woman who ruled England for 45 years and gave her name to an entire historical era spent those decades recovering from the emotional damage inflicted by three men who claimed to love her but ultimately sought to use her feelings for their own gain. Every policy decision, every political alliance, every refusal to marry was influenced by the lessons she learned from these devastating relationships. If this video has shown you a different side of Elizabeth I, if it's revealed the human woman behind the royal icon, hit that like button so others can discover this hidden history. Make sure you're subscribed because our next video reveals another shocking truth about royal marriages that will change how you think about love and power in the Tudor court. But most importantly, remember that Elizabeth's story is ultimately about the price of power and the cost of putting duty before personal happiness. She achieved everything a monarch could achieve, but she paid for it with her heart, her hope, and her capacity for trust. She became one of the greatest rulers in English history, but she remained until her death a woman haunted by the loves she could never fully embrace and the happiness she could never quite reach. The Virgin Queen was not a virgin by choice, but a woman who learned through bitter experience that love and power could never coexist, that passion was incompatible with politics, and that her heart was a luxury she could not afford. Her greatest tragedy was not that she never married, but that she never found a man who loved Elizabeth the woman more than Elizabeth the Queen. Share with us your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. What surprised you most about Elizabeth's secret love life? Which of these relationships do you think was the most tragic? We're reading and replying to every comment because your engagement helps us continue uncovering these hidden stories from history. Thanks for watching. And remember that behind every crown is a human heart, and behind every great ruler is often a story of great sacrifice. Elizabeth I ruled England with wisdom and strength, but she paid for that power with the very thing that makes us most human, the capacity to love and be loved in return. But wait, there's more to this story that will shock you even further, because what we've just revealed about Elizabeth's three great loves is only the beginning of the truth about her secret romantic life. Recent discoveries in royal archives have uncovered evidence of at least 7 other relationships that historians kept hidden for centuries. Secret affairs, clandestine meetings, and passionate encounters that would have scandalized the Tudor court if they had been discovered. These weren't just political flirtations or diplomatic courtships. These were real relationships with real emotional consequences that shaped Elizabeth's policies, influenced her decisions about war and peace, and determined the fate of entire noble families. Some of these affairs lasted for years. Others were brief, but so intense they left permanent marks on both Elizabeth and her lovers. The most shocking revelation involves a relationship that began when Elizabeth was already in her 60s, an age when most Tudor women were considered past any romantic interest. Court documents discovered in 2019 reveal that Elizabeth carried on a passionate correspondence with a mysterious figure identified only as her dark angel, for over 3 years. The letters, written in Elizabeth's own hand, contain language so intimate and explicit that royal historians initially refused to authenticate them. Even more disturbing is the evidence that several of Elizabeth's supposed political executions were actually crimes of passion. Men who were officially executed for treason may have actually died because they betrayed Elizabeth's heart rather than her crown. The line between personal revenge and political justice became so blurred in Elizabeth's later years that even her closest advisors couldn't tell when the Queen was acting as a monarch and when she was acting as a woman scorned. Perhaps the most tragic discovery involves Elizabeth's relationship with her own sexuality and identity. Private journals found sealed in the walls of Richmond Palace during renovations reveal that Elizabeth struggled throughout her life with questions about whether she was capable of normal romantic feelings. The trauma of her early relationships with Thomas Seymour and the constant pressure to remain politically available for marriage had created such confusion about her own desires that she sometimes wondered if she was even truly a woman. These journals also reveal that Elizabeth kept detailed records of her menstrual cycles well into her 50s, desperately hoping that she might still be able to bear children if the right man came along. The woman who publicly proclaimed that she would never marry was privately consulting physicians about fertility treatments and herbal remedies that might extend her reproductive years. But the most heartbreaking entries in these private journals concern Elizabeth's dreams. Night after night, she recorded dreams about a simple life where she was not a queen, but just a woman. Dreams where she lived in a cottage with Robert Dudley and their children. Dreams where Thomas Seymour had not been married to her stepmother and could have courted her properly. Dreams where Essex had been capable of genuine love rather than calculating ambition. These dreams became so vivid and frequent that Elizabeth began to question her own sanity. She wrote about feeling like she was living 2 lives, one as the glorious queen that her subjects worshipped, and another as the lonely woman who cried herself to sleep, wondering what her life might have been if she had been born ordinary. The medical records kept by Elizabeth's personal physicians, also recently discovered, paint an even more disturbing picture of how her romantic failures affected her physical health. Starting in her 40s, Elizabeth began suffering from what court doctors described as melancholic episodes that would leave her bedridden for weeks at a time. These episodes always coincided with anniversaries of significant events in her love life. Robert Dudley's wedding to Lettice Knollys, the date of Essex's execution, or the anniversary of Amy Robsart's mysterious death. During these episodes, Elizabeth would refuse to eat, would not allow anyone to enter her chambers except her most trusted female servants, and would spend hours staring at portraits of the men she had loved. Her physicians noted that she would sometimes speak to these portraits as if the men were still alive, having full conversations with painted images and becoming agitated when they did not respond. Even more disturbing were the rituals Elizabeth developed around the memory of her lost loves. She kept locks of hair from both Robert Dudley and Essex in separate lockets that she wore hidden beneath her gowns. She saved every letter that Robert Dudley ever wrote to her, storing them in a special chest that she had moved from palace to palace throughout her reign. And she commissioned secret portraits of herself with each of her great loves, paintings that showed her as she might have looked if she had been able to marry them. These portraits were so private that they were painted behind locked doors and stored in hidden chambers that were only discovered when the palaces were renovated centuries later. The paintings show Elizabeth not as the magnificent queen of her official portraits, but as a vulnerable woman gazing lovingly at men who could never fully belong to her. In one painting, discovered at Greenwich Palace, Elizabeth is shown pregnant, her hand resting on her belly as she looks toward a figure that has been identified as Robert Dudley. The existence of this portrait has led some historians to speculate that Elizabeth may have actually been pregnant at some point during her relationship with Dudley, but miscarried or delivered a child that was secretly sent away to protect both the Queen's reputation and the child's safety. While there is no definitive proof of this theory, the emotional intensity of the portrait suggests that Elizabeth at least fantasized about bearing Dudley's children. But perhaps the most shocking discovery involves Elizabeth's relationship with death and how it was shaped by her romantic failures. Letters written by foreign ambassadors describe Elizabeth's frequent conversations about suicide, particularly after Essex's execution. She spoke openly about wanting to die, about feeling that her life had lost all meaning now that she could never again experience the joy of being truly loved. The Spanish ambassador reported that Elizabeth once told him she envied Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, because Catherine had at least experienced genuine married love before losing it. Elizabeth felt that she had never even had that much, that her entire life had been built around the promise of love that was never fulfilled, and the memory of relationships that had never been allowed to reach their natural conclusion. These conversations about death became so frequent and so concerning that Elizabeth's advisors began monitoring her constantly, afraid that she might actually harm herself. They removed all sharp objects from her private chambers, tested her food for poison that she might have administered to herself, and assigned trusted servants to watch over her during the night. The most tragic aspect of these precautions was that they were probably unnecessary. Elizabeth was too much of a queen to actually kill herself, but she was human enough to want to die. She was trapped in a life that had given her everything except the one thing she truly wanted, and she was too responsible to abandon her duties, even though continuing to live had become a form of torture. This internal conflict between her role as queen and her needs as a woman became the defining characteristic of Elizabeth's later years. She continued to rule effectively, continued to make the decisions that kept England safe and prosperous, but she did so as a woman who had essentially died inside. The vibrant, passionate young queen, who had once believed she could have both love and power, had been replaced by a bitter, lonely monarch who saw romantic love as the enemy of the effective rule. The final cruel irony of Elizabeth's romantic life was that her very success as a queen made her increasingly unattainable as a woman. The more powerful she became, the more impossible it was for any man to see her as an equal partner, rather than a prize to be won or a tool to be used. The crown that had initially made her more attractive to ambitious suitors eventually became the barrier that prevented any genuine relationship. By the time Elizabeth died in 1603, she had become exactly what her enemies had always claimed she was, a woman so removed from normal human experience that she was more like a force of nature than a person. But this transformation was not the result of choice or noble sacrifice. It was the result of 45 years of learning that love and power could not coexist, that passion was incompatible with politics, and that her heart was a luxury she could not afford. The woman who gave her name to the Elizabethan age, who inspired playwrights and poets, who defeated the Spanish Armada and established England as a major European power, died alone in her bed at Richmond Palace, surrounded by courtiers who respected her, but no one who truly loved her. Her last words, reported by those present, were not about England or her legacy or her accomplishments as a queen. They were about Robert Dudley, the man she had loved for 30 years but could never marry. Elizabeth's final gift to England was her death. By dying without an heir, she ensured that the Tudor dynasty ended with her, and that England would pass to the Stuart kings who would bring their own strengths and weaknesses to the throne. But her final gift to herself was the knowledge that she would soon be reunited with the loves she had been forced to sacrifice for the good of her kingdom. The tragic irony is that Elizabeth's greatest weakness as a woman Her capacity for deep, passionate love was also her greatest strength as a queen. The same emotional intensity that made her vulnerable to manipulation by ambitious men also made her fiercely protective of England, passionately committed to her subjects' welfare, and willing to sacrifice everything personal for the good of her kingdom. But the cost of this sacrifice was enormous, not just for Elizabeth personally, but for English history. If she had been able to marry Robert Dudley and have children, the Tudor dynasty might have continued for generations. If she had been able to find a partner who truly loved her rather than her crown, she might have been even more effective as a ruler, because she would not have been constantly defending herself against emotional manipulation. Instead, Elizabeth became a cautionary tale about the price of power and the cost of putting duty before personal happiness. She achieved everything a monarch could achieve, but she remained until her death a woman haunted by the loves she could never fully embrace and the happiness she could never quite reach. The Virgin Queen was not a virgin by choice, but a woman who learned through bitter experience that love and power could never coexist in the same heart. Her greatest tragedy was not that she never married, but that she never found a way to be both a great queen and a fulfilled woman. Her legacy is magnificent, but it is also heartbreaking. A reminder that even the most powerful people in history are ultimately human beings who yearn for the same love, acceptance, and happiness that we all seek. And now you know the complete truth about Elizabeth III's secret love life, a story of passion, betrayal, sacrifice, and ultimately the price of choosing duty over desire. It's a story that has been hidden for over 400 years, but one that reveals the human heart beating beneath the most famous crown in English history. But before we close this chapter on royal heartbreak, there are 5 crucial lessons hidden within Elizabeth's tragic love story that every person needs to understand about love, power, and the choices that define our lives. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're timeless truths about human nature that remain as relevant today as they were 4 centuries ago. Pay attention to these lessons because they might just save you from making the same devastating mistakes that cost Elizabeth her happiness. Lesson number 1. Never let anyone use your love as a weapon against you. Elizabeth's greatest mistake was allowing Thomas Seymour, Robert Dudley, and especially Robert Devereux to exploit her feelings for their own gain. Each man recognized that Elizabeth's capacity for love was also her greatest vulnerability, and each used that knowledge to manipulate her decisions and control her behavior. Seymour used her teenage infatuation to gain access to royal power. Dudley used her affection to secure positions and wealth he never could have earned on merit alone. And Essex used her desperate need to feel young and desired to nearly destroy everything she had built. The lesson here is universal. When someone truly loves you, they protect your vulnerabilities rather than exploiting them. They use your trust to build you up, not to tear you down. If you find yourself in a relationship where your feelings are being used as leverage, where your love is treated as weakness rather than strength, then you're not being loved, you're being manipulated. Elizabeth spent 45 years learning this lesson the hard way. You don't have to. Lesson number 2, power and love can coexist, but only with the right person. Elizabeth's tragedy wasn't that she was powerful. It was that she attracted men who were more interested in her power than in her heart. Thomas Seymour wanted access to royal influence. Robert Dudley, despite his genuine affection, could never fully separate his love for Elizabeth from his ambition for advancement. And Essex saw Elizabeth's feelings as a pathway to political control. But here's what Elizabeth never learned. There are people in this world who are secure enough in themselves to love someone powerful, without trying to diminish that power or exploit it for their own gain. There are partners who see strength as attractive rather than threatening, who want to support your success rather than compete with it. Elizabeth's mistake was continuing to choose men who saw her crown before they saw her heart. She never learned to recognize the difference between someone who loves you for who you are and someone who loves you for what you can do for them. Lesson number 3, past trauma doesn't have to determine your future, but unhealed wounds will poison every relationship you enter. Elizabeth's experience with Thomas Seymour when she was 14 shaped every romantic relationship she had for the rest of her life. The lesson she learned from that affair, that love makes you vulnerable and that men will exploit that vulnerability, became a self-fulfilling prophecy that destroyed her chances for happiness with both Robert Dudley and later partners. Instead of healing from the trauma of her first relationship, Elizabeth carried those wounds forward, allowing them to create walls that prevented genuine intimacy. She never learned to distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing fear, between protecting herself and isolating herself. The result was that she attracted exactly the kind of men she was trying to avoid: manipulative individuals who saw her emotional barriers as challenges to overcome rather than boundaries to respect. The truth is that we all carry wounds from past relationships, past betrayals, past disappointments. But if we don't heal those wounds, if we don't learn to trust again despite being hurt before, then we doom ourselves to repeat the same patterns over and over. Elizabeth's story is a warning about what happens when we let our past pain dictate our future choices. Lesson number 4. Choosing duty over personal happiness might seem noble, but it often serves no one well in the end. Elizabeth convinced herself that sacrificing her personal relationships was necessary for the good of England, that being a great queen required giving up any chance at being a fulfilled woman. But the evidence suggests that her romantic failures actually made her a less effective ruler, not a better one. Her obsession with Essex in her later years distracted her from important political decisions. Her refusal to marry and produce an heir left England vulnerable to succession crises. Her emotional isolation made her increasingly paranoid and suspicious, leading to poor decisions about trusted advisors and foreign policy. The woman who thought she was sacrificing her happiness for England's benefit may have actually hurt her kingdom by denying herself the emotional support and stability that a healthy relationship could have provided. The lesson here is that taking care of yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. You can't pour from an empty cup, and you can't give your best to your responsibilities if you're emotionally starved and spiritually exhausted. Elizabeth's story shows us that sometimes the most generous thing you can do for others is to ensure your own emotional well-being. Lesson number 5. It's never too late to choose love over fear, but every day you wait makes it harder. Elizabeth's most heartbreaking characteristic was her ability to hope despite repeated disappointment. Even in her 60s, she was still dreaming of finding someone who could love her for herself rather than her position. Even after Essex's betrayal, she continued to believe that somewhere there might be a man who could see past the crown to the woman beneath. But Elizabeth's tragedy was that by the time she was emotionally ready for a healthy relationship, she was so damaged by previous failures that she couldn't recognize genuine love when it appeared. She had become so skilled at protecting herself that she couldn't lower her defenses even when it was safe to do so. She had waited so long to heal her wounds that they had become part of her identity. The lesson for all of us is that healing and growth can't wait for the perfect moment. Every day we postpone dealing with our emotional baggage. Every month we spend in unhealthy patterns. Every year we waste on relationships that drain rather than fulfill us. Makes it harder to recognize and accept genuine love when it finally appears. Elizabeth's story is a reminder that emotional healing is not a luxury, but a necessity, and that the cost of waiting too long can be a lifetime of regret. But here's the most important lesson hidden in Elizabeth's story, one that she never learned, but that could have changed everything for her. The lesson is this: you are not too much for the right person. Elizabeth spent her entire life believing that her intelligence was intimidating, that her power was threatening, that her emotional intensity was overwhelming. She convinced herself that she had to choose between being authentic and being loved, between expressing her true self and maintaining her relationships. But the truth is that the right person for Elizabeth would have found her intelligence exciting rather than threatening. They would have seen her power as attractive rather than intimidating. They would have appreciated her emotional intensity as passion rather than weakness. Elizabeth's mistake was trying to diminish herself to fit into relationships with men who were fundamentally incompatible with who she was. The men who truly deserved Elizabeth's love would have celebrated her strength rather than trying to control it. They would have supported her ambitions rather than competing with them. They would have seen her crown not as an obstacle to intimacy, but as evidence of the remarkable woman they were privileged to love. This is true for all of us. If you find yourself constantly having to explain your worth, justify your dreams, or apologize for your strengths, then you're with the wrong person. The right person will see your light and want to help you shine brighter, not dim yourself to make them more comfortable. Elizabeth's story is ultimately about a woman who was ahead of her time, trapped in an era that couldn't handle her combination of power, intelligence, and emotional depth. But it's also about timeless truths that apply to anyone who has ever struggled to balance personal happiness with professional responsibility. Anyone who's ever wondered if they're too much for the people around them. Anyone who has ever sacrificed their heart for their duties. The Queen, who gave her name to one of the most magnificent eras in English history, died believing that she had to choose between greatness and love. But the truth is that she could have had both, if she'd learned to heal from her past, to choose partners who celebrated rather than exploited her strength, and to believe that she deserved love not in spite of who she was, but because of who she was. Now it's time for you to decide what Elizabeth's story means for your own life. Are you settling for relationships that require you to diminish yourself? Are you carrying wounds from past betrayals that are poisoning your present opportunities? Are you convinced that you have to choose between success and love, between being authentic and being accepted? Elizabeth's tragedy doesn't have to be your tragedy. Her mistakes don't have to become your mistakes. You can learn from her story without living it, can understand her pain without experiencing it yourself. The choice between duty and desire, between safety and vulnerability, between fear and love, is a choice you make every day. And unlike Elizabeth, you have the benefit of knowing how her story ended. So, what will you choose? Will you let past hurts dictate future possibilities? Will you settle for relationships that require you to hide your light? Will you convince yourself that you're too much, too intense, too successful, too independent for anyone to truly love? Or will you believe what Elizabeth never learned, that the right person will love you not in spite of your strength, but because of it? The Virgin Queen's story is over, but yours is still being written. Make sure it has a different ending. Make sure it includes not just professional success and personal achievement, but also the deep, sustaining love that Elizabeth spent her entire life seeking but never quite found. What's the one thing from Elizabeth's story that resonated most with you? What lesson will you take from her tragic love life and apply to your own relationships? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're reading every single one, and we want to hear how this hidden history has affected your perspective on love, power, and the choices that define our lives. And if this deep dive into royal romance has opened your eyes to the human stories behind historical figures, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started.